What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you all of the reviews I have done this year ranked. Now, this is a video I like to make every year, but as you might imagine, there's a few things to go over here at the beginning before we dive fully into it. For starters, this is mostly meant to be fun and is how I personally feel about each of these games, so the idea that it's fair or objective in any way is nonsense, because it is not. It is simply about what games I personally enjoyed the most for one reason or another, which is as subject to any biases and opinions of mine as you could imagine, not to mention differences in genre, price, production, quality, studio size, etc. And to that end, this list is purely meant to just be fun, which I mention solely because pretty much every year somebody gets way too worked up about it. But since it is Christmas Eve, I'm simply going to tell you Merry Christmas and go on my way. A couple of other things though, just to kind of get ahead of comments so I don't have to answer a million of them. 60 games is a lot of games to review in a single year, but a few things to note there are that one of them is actually from 2023. I just reviewed it on December 30th of that year, so it made sense to lump it in here. Another thing is that some of these games only took like a single day. Off the top of my head, Flint and Indika were one-day events. Games like Rogue Waters only took like 2 days. So some of these games are simply very short, which is a contributing factor. Another thing is that some of the bigger games I reviewed this year I already had a ton of experience with, such as Oblivion, The Witcher 3, Fallout 4 even. I'd played those games extensively, and those playthroughs were mostly aimed at just gathering footage for the review, and thus they did not take as long as they would have normally if I was reviewing the entire thing. And second to last, I had to debate with myself whether or not to include Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, which is my most played game of 2024 because I just love that game if you know the channel at all, and I did technically review it this year. It got its final DLC and content update, so I went back and reviewed it with all of those things in mind now that that game is in effect done. But the thing is, because I love it and all of those reasons, everyone knows it would have just been at the top of the list, so I decided not to include it because it was obviously going to be number one, and that's no fun for anybody. And last but not least, before we dive fully into this thing, as a reminder, I have reviews for all of these games, which should be obvious, but I mention it purely because I'm going to be moving very quickly here, so this video doesn't go on for absolutely ever. If you want my extended thoughts about any single one of these, all you've got to do is go click on one of the reviews and you're good to go. But with all of that said, let's finally dive fully into this, starting at the very bottom with number 60, which goes to Deathbound. Deathbound was, I would say, an experimental Souls-like that released earlier this year back in August. Its main mechanics focus on switching between a bunch of different characters who all have their own moveset and a shared health pool. And while it has some neat ideas, while I was playing through it, I just kind of realized I didn't like basically anything about this game, at least in terms of execution. I liked one or two of its ideas, but at the end of the day, the way it was implemented just wasn't for me. And the thing about rankings is that somebody's got to take the bottom spot, and thus it goes to Deathbound. Coming in at 59, however, we have Fable 3. I re-reviewed the entire Fable series this year to basically just refresh my memory ahead of the eventual launch of the reboot, and it was illuminating. I hadn't played those games in a very long time, like middle school to be specific. But in re-experiencing all those games, I got to remember just firsthand how not great Fable 3 is. It's a game where it's essentially impossible to die. Most of the interesting features from the previous two games had been gutted, and it's another game that simply plays around with some novel concepts and then ultimately fails to deliver on basically all of them. So while I don't hate everything about it, almost everything I do like winds up being just poorly implemented anyway, so that's what it is doing all the way at the bottom of the list. Now from this point on to about, I would say roughly the lower middle half of the list, we have games that are interesting in one sense or another, but are flawed in some way that puts them so low. Which is why at 58 we first have Unknown 9. Unknown 9 is set in an established world that they are in the process of expanding out, which is why this video game exists really. And to that end, the actual world it takes place in is pretty interesting, where there is this old civilization that is trying to stop a cycle of constant destruction with the world at large, and some people are able to interact with an extra dimension known as the Fold to effectively use forms of magic, and that stuff was honestly pretty interesting, but unfortunately the rest of the game suffers from a whole host of janky mechanics that clearly lack some polish, and a combat system, especially the boss fights, that aren't fun, and to top it all off, a high price, and you've got a game that's hard to recommend to people, except on a pretty deep sale. Following on from that, we have the CRPG Broken Roads, which in fairness to this game, it has released some patches and stuff since it launched that I haven't personally been able to check out as recently as December 10th, so it looks like they might be starting to turn this one around. But as a CRPG set in Western Australia, and any CRPG at all really, has my attention, and combined with its, I would say, novel morality system, it was a game with some interesting ideas. But unfortunately, all of the various issues with continuity and things like that you could run into when the game released, on top of combat and itemization that just really wasn't up to par. So that's what it's doing so low on this particular list. Sometime in the future, I might take a second look at it just to check out all the improvements that they've made since, but as of right now, that was my experience at the time. Coming in at number 56, however, we then have Flint, Treasure of Oblivion, which is a short and sweet tactical RPG. I knocked this one out in a single day. It's about a pirate, as you might imagine, looking for some form of treasure after hearing a legend. And while I think this one is interesting if you really like tactical RPGs, because it uses its own system, which is actually a pretty interesting system that I enjoyed running through, but nonetheless, the controls for it are definitely a bit janky. It is, as I mentioned, a very short game, which means despite being a tactical game, there's I think maybe 20 fights total. So unless you just really love that genre, it's unlikely to make much of an impression on you. And then we have Zoria, the Age of Shattering, another CRPG type game that released very early in the year. And while I don't think anything about Zoria is bad in any way, it's mostly just an entire game that lacks polish in almost every respect. I enjoy their class system, I enjoy their loot system, I enjoy some of the way they handled quests and the base building even. So mostly this one's so low because the entire thing just really needs some polish that it is, let's be honest, probably never going to get, but it's pretty decent if that kind of thing doesn't bother you. Moving right along, however, we then have Indika. Indika was a bizarre narrative game about a nun living in an alternative history, Russia, who just happens to be mentally unwell. And as such, this is a game where she is grappling with her faith through the lens of all those different factors, and it's a really interesting and strange game. And its interesting concepts are why it's a bit further up the list than the others, because otherwise it's just a really short experience. I think 100% on this took me literally 5 hours. But that said, it was a very enjoyable 5 hours with a really interesting story. But there's ultimately just not a lot to this one. Next up, we've got yet another tactical RPG, this time Crown Wars: The Black Prince, a game set during the 100 Years' War, and the quickest way to describe it might just be medieval XCOM, and in that sense, it's pretty good actually. The combat I enjoyed. I think they did a lot of fun things with some of the missions and even some of the upgrades and whatnot, but technical problems really ate into this one, and that's really why it's not a bit higher up on the list actually, mostly just because those bugs can get in the way of the experience, and honestly I think enemies probably rank up a little too fast in terms of the general progression. So it's a solid TRPG, but performance certainly leaves a bit to be desired. That brings us to our very first boomer shooter though, with Graven. Graven is a game inspired by the likes of Hexen, and I've been enjoying boomer shooters lately just to get a break from all the RPGs and just simply shoot things, but while Graven was mostly pretty fun, I did have a few issues in particular. One, navigation can be pretty annoying because there is not a map, and there was a map at one point that was ultimately taken out of it, and the game does not do a fantastic job about telegraphing where you need to go half the time, which means it's pretty easy to get lost. And while it's not impossible to work around that by any means, that combined with yet a few more bugs definitely ate into the experience a bit, and I think it could have been a lot smoother overall. But speaking of fun but ultimately flawed games, we then have We Happy Few. We Happy Few is a game I had wanted to play for a long time because I had, of course, seen a few things here and there about it, and it looked really interesting, but I had heard that it was using some bizarre procedural generation system. But it's a game I finally got around to playing this year, and it's a game that definitely has a lot of really cool ideas. But it's also a game that winds up being extremely tedious to play after a little while, especially once you get done with the first of 3 different characters' stories before you see the real ending. And each time you switch characters, the entire map resets, and you're already going to be spending a lot of time running back and forth around that map. And because of that, I would describe We Happy Few as initially quite fun, but it's a game that overstays its welcome by a lot. And I really don't feel like the procedural generation really accomplishes much. Moving on though, we then have another Souls-like with Enotria. Enotria was a Souls-like based on Italian folklore that I wanted to try out. And while I have played a lot of janky Souls-likes, Enotria had a little too much jank for me. It has a lot of fun moments, I really enjoy the art direction, a lot of the enemy design, but the general jank combined with some weapons that didn't feel good to use at all, like greatswords for me, systems that wound up being basically nothing, like a lot of the elemental status that they try to put a lot of emphasis on, and as a result, the mechanic that revolves around switching loadouts just felt like it all needed a little more time in the oven, which is why it's still kind of towards the bottom here. But that brings us to the 40s with number 49, Fable 2. Now, Fable 2 was a game that when I played it, I remembered not really loving so much. And while I do think it was a bit better than my memory of it was, it still unfortunately made a lot of changes from the original Fable that I didn't really enjoy. I also think the story's pretty bad, a complete rehash of the first game somehow, like plot beat for plot beat almost, which makes the part of it that it does improve from the first game hard to enjoy. I still had a bit of fun with it because again, it was just simply a little better than I remembered it being, and it still has a pretty good sense of humor all these years later, but nonetheless, I still wouldn't consider it a great game by any stretch. Which is kind of how I feel about our next title, Outcast A New Beginning, a follow-up to a much older title that kind of helped pioneer those 3D open world games, but unfortunately, the sequel itself is mostly just a lot of same old same in terms of everything it does. On one hand, I think the movement of the game is quite fun, flying around the world here, but outside of that, this game just doesn't do anything unique, really. It's just kind of another checklist open world, and while that's not a terrible experience, it's also pretty run-of-the-mill, which is why it's a bit lower on the list. Keeping with our theme of interesting ideas, in slightly less than stellar execution, we then have Slitterhead. Slitterhead puts us in the role of a spirit that can possess people's bodies in order to fight off monsters known as Slitterheads. This possession mechanic and a lot of the gameplay around that are pretty interesting, actually, but unfortunately, everything else about the game is underwhelming. The combat is very janky, the animations are weird, the story is constantly flitting around with things like time travel both to the past and then later to a future and then later on to like an alternate universe of that timeline, and it's incredibly hard to follow what's going on half the time as a result of that. And it feels like the kind of game that's going to wind up being a cult classic at some point because it has its moments that are really cool, but otherwise hard to recommend. That brings us to number 46 with Capes. Capes is a TRPG set in a world of superheroes where the bad guys have won, however. They have taken over the city and we are doing our best to fight back despite being largely outgunned and on the run, as it were, as heroes or capes have been outlawed. Now, as TRPGs go, this one is decent. I like the superheroes. They all get a lot of interesting powers, but unfortunately, this tends to be a TRPG that's much more on the side of puzzle tactics, where there's kind of a right way to do things, and while you can do things other than that way, if you want to get especially the extra experience from completing challenges and things, which you're probably going to need to upgrade characters, it can get a little boring because, again, there's simply a right way to do those things, which can get in the way a bit, but otherwise it's pretty solid. Next up, we have another TRPG with Rogue Waters, a short and sweet game that is all about pirates having tactical battles, but also you get to command a whole bunch of sea monsters that can affect the battlefield. It's also got a bit of a roguelike element to it where you'll move through various stages, and there's even a ship battling mechanic that then goes on to affect the battles that you'll have on the deck. And Rogue Waters is a short and sweet TRPG that knows exactly what it wants to do, and it does it pretty well. And while nothing about this game will likely blow you away in any sense, it's a lot of fun if you enjoy the genre. Coming in at 44, though, we have Sovereign Syndicate. This is another narrative title that released all the way back in January, and while I enjoy a good narrative if the story's good, which it is here, what I really enjoyed about Sovereign Syndicate was the world that they had put together, as I'm a big fan of the whole steampunk meets magic type of thing that we see in games like Arcanum, but that gets a little extra flavor with things like Minotaurs being known for their illusion magic, which is one of the ways they avoid conflict, especially with centaurs for some reason, which they don't get along with. And there's a whole host of things like that that are really interesting to see and experience about Sovereign Syndicate that I think make it a pretty interesting title. But as with most narrative games, it winds up being pretty niche overall. But if you like that kind of thing, or you just want a really good story, I think it's worth taking the time to look at. Now, in a very different vein, we then have Dragon's Dogma 2. Now, if you watch the channel much, you probably know that Dragon's Dogma 2 was my biggest disappointment of the year. It's still decently high up on the list because because I do think there are parts of it that are fun, like the combat that I enjoyed quite a bit, but also because I think if you have not played the first game, you'll be likely to enjoy Dragon's Dogma 2 here more than I did, because while I enjoy it, it really does feel more like Dragon's Dogma 1.5 rather than a full-blown sequel. And I could talk about this one for a while, so you're better off going and watching the review, or we'll be here for quite some time. But basically, while I was very disappointed in this game, I don't think it's completely meritless either, but I sure wouldn't pay $70 for it, I'll tell you that. But then at 42, we have another narrative title with Still Wakes the Deep. A game from developer The Chinese Room. This game takes place entirely on a oil rig in 1975 off the coast of Scotland, where it turns out we dug a little too greedily and too deep and hit something that we shouldn't have, and thus we have to find our way through an oil rig beset by eldritch horrors through a fantastically creepy and well-paced experience. Now, this game is not particularly long, but it does a lot with a little in terms of its runtime, and again, if you enjoy really solid stories and narratives, I think this one is worth checking out. Next up, however, we have Dredge. Dredge is a kind of bizarre game, but also Lovecraftian in nature, where we play as a fisherman who gets involved in, unsurprisingly, an eldritch plot that sees us fishing up terrible horrors from the deep while we upgrade both our equipment and our boat as try to handle all of this stuff, taking part in some fantastically creepy things along the way. Dredge has an amazing opening, like 5 hours, and then it starts to get a little routine and a little tedious. I do think it's a great game. I think the Iron Rig DLC in particular really added a lot to it as well, but it's also a very simple game, and thus it's a little bit lower down. Next up, however, we have Souls-Light Flintlock: The Siege of Dawn. Now this is largely an action-adventure with what the developers described as Souls-Light elements, which I would in fact agree with, and the combat in particular is a lot of fun. I think if anything, this game could have stood to be a bit more ambitious, but running around various areas, moving through the environment with the help of your fallen god companion Inky is a really good time, and the story itself is pretty solid, and altogether it made for just a really solid overall experience from start to finish for me, which is kind of why it's towards the middle of the pack here. Moving into the 30s, we then have another boomer shooter with Boltgun. Warhammer 40k has been having a pretty good year with some other titles that I have played, but also one more at least coming up. But Boltgun is a sort of retro-inspired boomer shooter that sees us tearing apart the enemies of humanity in Warhammer 40k, and it is a fantastically good time. Now, what I wanted from this game when I picked it up was a nice little palate cleanser from all the RPGs I was playing, and it manages to do just that perfectly well. What you see is pretty much what you get. It's a boomer shooter where we fight the various enemies present in Warhammer 40k, but it's a ton of fun to play. They nail the little details of it. And if you're looking for a game that just lets you shoot and destroy everything you see, Boltgun is a fantastic choice, which is why it is in its position at 39. But coming in at number 38, we then have Sandland, a game based on the world created by Akira Toriyama that puts you in the role of Fiend Prince Beelzebub as you search for water to help out everyone in the area, basically. And really, I enjoyed playing this one with my son quite a bit, but also the vehicle customization and the upgrades you can make to the town that you get access to are a lot of fun to engage with. But in particular, I enjoyed running around and playing this one with my son and letting him build vehicles and, of course, blow apart enemies with them. And we had a really good time together with this one, and that's why it is where it is. The story probably won't blow you away, but it is a lot of fun otherwise. Which brings us to Eiyuden Chronicle: 100 Heroes, a spiritual successor to Suikoden, which is a game no one agrees on how to pronounce, by the way. But ultimately, if you enjoy JRPGs at all, you'll probably really enjoy this one, as I did. The only thing I'd say is it can get a little tedious managing just the sheer amount of heroes you get access to. There's literally like 100 of them. And while not all of them contribute to combat, most of them can. But if you actually want to make use of all those characters, it can be difficult to do so because of just the sheer mental work you've got to do in keeping up with everyone's gear, which is why you're likely to only reduce it down to like a sort of cadre of people you'll actually be using, but otherwise, very good time. Moving right along, however, We then have Pacific Drive. Pacific Drive was such a fun, unique little indie game that combines a lot of things in a way I just hadn't seen before, which is why I had such a good time with it. And while I think it probably runs a little too long, a game that puts us in the role of someone driving an anomalous car in an anomalous zone, trying to survive while we also gather resources and energy to keep fixing up our car, upgrading our shop, and driving on to the next area, which will itself be bizarrely strange and at the same time deadly, of course, while dealing with all sorts of almost survival-esque mechanics. It's a really good time in a way that is, as I mentioned, unique, which is what it's doing so far up on the list, because when you've reviewed as many games as I have, unique tends to be hard to come by. Coming in at 35, however, we have Sumerian 6, a game from Artificer that largely aims to take up the mantle of Me Games and their stealth strategy titles. This one takes place in an alternative history World War II, where we have to fight off Nazis and their deadly experiments into things like demons, all while naturally using our stealth tactics and characters who have various ways of stealthily dispatching enemies, and it's very fun. If you like that kind of thing at all, I think Sumerian 6 is a great adaptation of it, which is the second game from that developer I have really enjoyed. Keeping it moving though, we then have the Thaumaturge, published by 11-Bit Studios, which has made a few different games I've really enjoyed, but the Thaumaturge puts us in the role of a Thaumaturge, as you might imagine, during the period of 20th century Warsaw, where you have to get to the bottom of various happenings so you can track down salutors who attach themselves to people, typically with some sort of flaw that they are attracted to, and you're going to wind up catching these things and using them in the turn-based battles, which kind of makes it feel like a Lovecraftian version of Pokemon, and combine that with a really cool story to tell, and you've got a very cool game, which is why it is towards the upper half of this particular list. Coming in at 33, however, we have Classified France 44, which is a look at the lead up to D-Day in Nazi-occupied France during World War II, where we will lead a team of Jedburghs so you can influence the outcome of D-Day itself, mimicking real historical events, and one of the outcomes is basically what actually happened in history, but you can also, depending on your success or failure, have a few different endings as well. Now, this is done through the guise of a TRPG that is very well executed, a variety of different missions, some involving more stealth and then others outright combat. But altogether, it was a very good time, if only because I'm at that age where a man gets real into World War II. But speaking of war and TRPGs, we then have Gears Tactics. This is an older TRPG that a lot of people had been asking me to check out for quite some time, as you could probably tell because I play a lot of these games. But Gears Tactics is a fantastic tactics adaptation of the Gears franchise. In fact, it's almost shocking how well that franchise fits into exactly what they were doing here. Now, my main issues with this game are that it requires an Xbox Live account, even when you play it on Steam, which was bizarre. But otherwise, there's just not a lot of content here for an otherwise really fun game. I think if they had had more variety to it, it probably would have been even a little bit higher. But this is a great tactics title that left me wishing there was just more to do. And having a game that makes you want to have more of it is not the worst thing that could happen to you. Moving right along, however, we have yet another tactical RPG with Tactical Breach Wizards. This is a really fun TRPG that personifies the meme of a wizard saying, "I might be out of spells, but I'm not out of shells." Because we lead a team of renegade wizards, utilizing both modern weaponry and actual spells and magic to take on a whole host of different situations, but mainly a conspiracy involving your former partner of a special ops team. It's unique, it's quirky, you get to throw people out windows. It's a great time. Like many a TRPG, though, it does kind of fall into that space where it tends to be a bit more of a puzzle game than a tactics game at times, with a lot of situations and especially certain challenges having basically a correct way to do them, and that brings it down a little bit for me, but it was still very fun. Halfway at number 30, however, we then have, believe it or not, another TRPG. This time, though, it is Phantom Doctrine, another one that people had been asking me to take a look at, and this one is a little bit different because it is primarily a espionage TRPG. A lot of the point, and sometimes even entirely, you can get through a mission almost entirely via stealth. But this one takes place during the Cold War, and you'll lead a group of spies getting to the bottom of yet another global conspiracy. But while you do that, it has a ton of unique and interesting mechanics based around, of course, infiltrating places, setting up before those missions to plant things like your own double multiple agents, or a whole host of other things you can do. It was a really great CRPG. I do think it runs on probably a bit too long, but it has a ton of really deep systems to engage with and ways to build up and prepare for individual missions, and because of that and what you can do on those missions with the actual espionage and disguise side of things, makes for a really, really good time, which is why it's as high up as it is, even if it does, as I mentioned, go on probably a bit too long. Coming into the top half of the list, however, we then have Fable. As it turns out, I can safely say for sure that Fable 1 is my favorite of the original Fable trilogy. It sets up a lot of interesting stuff that the other two games just kind of fail to completely iterate and expand upon while keeping what worked from that original title. So while they go on to occasionally add the interesting system here or there or expand it in interesting ways like what they did with the property management side of it, which I do actually think got better as the games went on, I don't think 2 or 3 ever quite live up to what Fable offered, which is a real shame, which means that Reboot is pretty wide open in terms of quality because the original trilogy really weren't that incredible as far as games go, and Fable is the only one I really think was a great time, so hopefully that's the one they take the most inspiration from. Coming in at number 28, however, we have 7, The Days Long Gone. A game that combines a whole host of genres like immersive sim, stealth games, ARPGs, etc. So there's just a lot going on here with 7. But it puts you in the role of a master thief ultimately sent to prison after being caught during a job in which you were sort of fused with a high-tech phantom that is living inside you, granting powers, and you'll have to use those powers as well as all of the other systems the game has to offer to traverse this prison island, getting to the bottom of what happened here and what they are looking for, which turns out to be a really good time. If you haven't checked out 7, I would recommend you do so. It's actually a game that's kind of hard to describe because it's doing so many things at once, but it is a ton of fun. Coming in at number 27, however, we then have Banishers, Ghosts of New Eden, a game that I think wound up getting a bit overshadowed this year, but this is from Don't Nod, the makers of Vampire, and as such it has a tremendous story where we play as Banishers who get involved in investigations where they track down ghosts who have attached themselves to people and thus are slowly killing them, and then you can banish these ghosts to their afterlife, or kill the person they're haunting in an attempt to bring your dead wife back to life after you get involved in the main story's massive haunting that you're trying to deal with. Very cool game though, a little bit of jank in there, and I wish the investigations were a little more open-ended, but overall, very cool game, very worth your time. Now at number 26, we have a genre near and dear to me with CRPGs. In particular though, Drakensang. Drakensang is an older CRPG set in Germany's The Dark Eye. Now that was interesting to me because that was a system I was unaware of or, hadn't really messed with before I jumped into Drakensang, and I wound up enjoying it quite a bit. I wouldn't say I love it more than some of the systems I grew up with, but learning this system in order to play this game and check out this CRPG was interesting to me just because I was unfamiliar with it, and that will likely pose a barrier to entry to basically anyone who tries this out. Drakensang is nonetheless a fantastic CRPG if you can get used to that system. In fact, I would say it's pretty similar to Dragon Age Origins, if that's of any interest to you. At number 25, however, we have Drakensang's sequel, Drakensang 2, which takes everything from that first game and basically improves it. Though technically speaking, it is a prequel to the original title. In every other way besides the story, it basically just improves upon the system and the adaptation of it into video games and everything and makes that experience smoother overall. And you can tell that experience really paid off here because just as a result, it's a much smoother CRPG. So if you only plan on playing one of the Drakensangs, it might be better to jump into this one as they are only loosely connected anyway. So there's that for you. Now coming in at number 24, we have another tactical RPG via Metal Slug Tactics. This was a revival of sorts for the Metal Slug series, but in tactics form, and it worked out surprisingly well. Metal Slug Tactics was a lot of fun as it combines tactical battles with roguelike elements that I would say keep the game from falling into the trap of puzzle mechanics that a lot of other TRPGs can, and what's more, you ultimately get a whole bunch of different characters. You only take 3 of them with you at a time on a run, and how you mix and match these characters and what sort of playstyles you can unlock as a result of that is where a lot of the gameplay is, and it does that really well, while at the same time, probably via its art style to be honest, reminding me of older TRPGs from like the NES era, and you've got a pretty good time. I will say, if you want to fully run through the game and get the true ending, it can get a bit repetitive because you'll see a lot of the same areas and stuff repeated, so I do think it could probably use a little more content, but otherwise it was a ton of fun and I really enjoyed it. Inching ever closer to the top, however, we then have Fallout 3, a game I finally completed this year, and it was a lot of fun. Of the Fallout games, I would say this game has probably the best atmosphere overall, but at the same time I do think Fallout New Vegas took what worked from this system and made some smart decisions and iterations on the progression systems to make it feel a little bit better. So while I enjoyed Fallout 3, especially the atmosphere of the Capital Wasteland, it's definitely starting to get on in age a bit, and I do think New Vegas improved a lot of its systems overall. Coming in at number 22, however, we then have God of War Ragnarok, which was a pretty fun game. It came to PC this year, which is why I reviewed it, and while I enjoyed it for the most part, I would say the reason it's not a little farther up is ultimately because I don't think it's quite as good as the previous entry. I've heard they sort of smashed two games together here because there was supposed to be like a trilogy thing going on, but they only wound up doing this one instead of another sequel after this, but whether or not that's true or not, I'm not sure. However, nonetheless, it's just not quite as well paced as the original, and while I enjoyed it, and I enjoy stories like this in particular, you know, the struggles of having to raise your son when you're a father yourself, I think resonates with a lot of people, and it did me as well. So I enjoyed it quite a bit. They expanded on some things from the original title, especially in terms of combat, that were fun, but I don't think it quite hits the same highs as that original for sure. But then at number 21, we have Final Fantasy 16, a game that does spectacle boss fights better than many other titles, I would say. Really the best part of this game for me was these dramatic over-the-top fights between you and other Ekons, but nonetheless it's pretty different from other Final Fantasy titles to be sure. But I would say the main thing for me really was just that the game was a bit bloated in terms of its side content, which wasn't all that interesting, but everything else about it was pretty fun, which is why it's so high up on the list. But coming in at number 20, we then have Geneforge 2, an old CRPG that saw a remaster this year, which is why I reviewed it. And Geneforge in particular kind of hits a lot of things for me in terms of just, you know, being a CRPG, my favorite genre. But if you've never played a Geneforge game, it's about wizards known as the Shapers who can effectively create life, and there's all sorts of ethical ramifications that come with that these games dive into, and it's really, really cool. Not to mention, though, that Geneforge 2 has an incredible story. It's definitely the highlight of this game, but being able to play a few different characters and either shape and create various creatures to serve you, or go a more stealth solo route and all these other options combined with that really cool story in a genre that I love, and you've got a recipe for a win here. I liked Geneforge 2 a lot, which is why it was at number 20. But what I liked more than Geneforge 2 was Skald Against the Black Priory, a CRPG that is Lovecraftian in nature, where we're trying to get to the bottom of a dark conspiracy that, again, just has Lovecraftian vibes all over it. Some of it's a pretty direct inspiration, just straight up quoting a few of the stories here and there. But on top of that, you've got this really interesting class system that is obviously inspired by games like Ultima, and it's exactly the sort of thing I love, which is why it's so high up on the list. Coming in at number 18, however, we then have Dishonored 2. I really enjoyed playing through Dishonored 2, mainly because of its huge step up in gameplay from the original Dishonored, this time allowing you to play as either Emily Kaldwin or Corvo again, each of which has a unique set of powers and gadgets and whatnot, and it's just a really, really finely tuned immersive sim that boasts some incredible level design, as you might imagine, and it was a real joy to play through this one. Coming in at number 17, however, we then have Dread Delusion. Dread Delusion is a bizarre little game that has an incredibly interesting world to learn about and explore, as it takes place in a world that has largely killed their gods, as they brought nothing but suffering and pain to everyone. But believe it or not, that's barely even the tip of the iceberg as far as strange happenings in this game go, and while I don't think the combat is anything to write home about, to be sure, everything else about this game is incredibly interesting, and it makes for a delightfully weird game to play through, which is what it's doing so high up on this list. But just above that, we then have Star Wars Outlaws, A game I enjoyed for a few different reasons, and while I don't think it's worth $70, mind you, there are some things I really enjoyed about it, namely just the fact that it tells a story that isn't just about the Jedi in this giant galaxy with a million interesting things to do. Not everything needs to be about the Jedi and the Sith every time, so putting you in the role of someone who is not those things is naturally interesting to me, but what really sold this game for me was actually its reputation system, which could dynamically change the missions you would take on, as each area that you might run into is controlled by one of the game's various cartels, and your reputation with that cartel determines your general access to that area. And while some places are always off limits, a lot of those areas can be accessed if you simply have a generally friendly reputation with these people, which means how easy it is to get in and out of certain areas is dependent upon that system, and that reputation system being extremely flexible. As a smuggler or a scoundrel, those reputations go up and down all the time, and you're pretty free to do as you will. So ultimately, there was a lot about this game I really enjoyed, which is what it's doing so high up on this particular list. But that does nonetheless bring us to our top 15, and we are kicking that off with Space Marine 2, a big, brash, action-packed game where we take on the role of a Space Marine, either a Set 1 Titus via the main story or a more generic one via the PvE side missions called Operations, or even potentially a Heretic Astartes via the multiplayer, depending on the team you get assigned to. But either way, a Space Marine, and we're going to be using that powerhouse mountain of meat to blast our way through various foes. This game was a ton of fun to play action-wise. I loved tearing apart Tyranids and the forces of chaos as a Space Marine. I really enjoyed the main story even. It has a lot of very over-the-top moments, as you would expect from this particular franchise. And for a game I went into not even knowing if I was actually going to review it or not, I came away from it having a blast, and while I wouldn't say it's my favorite genre or anything, this game was very cool, and my main complaint when I was done with it is just that there wasn't more of it and more varied operations and things like that for your character, and I think there are worse things a game could do than leave you wanting more, which is why it's so high on the list, because it is genuinely a great time. But there are nonetheless some games to go, so then we have Metaphor, Refantasio, a different spin on the Persona formula that sees us with a group of unlikely heroes trying to stop the takeover of a kingdom by a madman who assassinated the previous king, which triggered some sort of democracy magic where the next leader will be elected by the merit of their deeds, and altogether it's a great JRPG. There are some minor quibbles I have with it, I didn't love all of it, but by and large this is the type of game I really enjoy, and it was a blast to play, which is not a terribly dissimilar situation from our number 13 entry, which was Drova. Drova is best described as isometric Gothic. If you've never played Gothic, I've got reviews for those games too. It's a lot to explain here, but basically the game takes the great core ideas from that series and then applies them to this one, and seeing how Piranha Bytes, the makers of Gothic, are no more, that's definitely noteworthy. But combine that with an interesting world that they've put you in, a lot of factions and choices to be made between those factions and whatnot, and you've got a great time. So Drova is a fantastic indie experience, which is what it's doing on this particular list, and I'm very happy I decided to take a look at it at my viewer's request. It kind of flew under my own radar before people had mentioned it to me. Now, coming in at number 12, we have Fallout 4. Fallout 4 is an interesting game because there's parts of it that I don't like at all, as I 100% this game years ago and then just sort of reviewed it this year to take a second look at it after the next-gen update and the TV show and stuff. But Fallout 4 is really great when it comes to like exploration and atmosphere and moving around the world and its overall gameplay. And while the RPG elements I do think leave a lot to be desired, I enjoy running around that world so much and what it enables you to do in terms of how you approach combat and even what survival mode enables. And then the Far Harbor DLC, and for me at least, that stuff is enough to outweigh the negatives of the game, which definitely exist. So while I don't love everything about it, I do genuinely have a great time with Fallout 4 pretty much every time I play it, which is why it's so close to the top. But following on from that, in a somewhat similar theme, we then have Stalker 2. Stalker 2 is awesome. I enjoyed the non-linear story and how you could choose between the various factions, and that led to all the game's different endings. And truth be told, this game would actually be a little bit higher on the list if it didn't have so many technical problems, which really got in the way of the experience. And while it's pretty good right now, I think this is a game that will be incredible if it's patched up and fixed. But as much fun as I had with it, the, I would say, significant amount of technical problems I ran into definitely kind of bit into the experience a bit, but otherwise it was a ton of fun. Coming in at number 10, however, we have Black Myth WuKong. A Souls-like rooted in Chinese mythology and the novel Journey to the West, this game puts us in the role of a monkey following in the footsteps of Sun Wukong, taking on all sorts of beasts and other mythological creatures as we fight them naturally in very fast-paced, action-oriented combat, and in that respect, the game is incredible. I love the way some of this looks, some of the spectacle of these boss fights and stuff, and while I do think the game has its shortcomings, especially Chapter 3 wasn't an incredibly fun time. I think it went on way too long, and then Chapter 6 was like a giant empty map for the most part, which was an odd choice, as that one feels a little bit unfinished, but in spite of those things, it was a ton of fun playing through this game, finding out its secrets, exploring the combat system and how you could like transform into things or use various bits of magic to influence the way individual boss fights would play out. And as someone who enjoys these types of games, Black Myth really was a must play for me. I had a ton of fun with it, and it definitely earned one of the top spots. But that brings us to the final countdown, so to speak, starting with Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, one of my most played games this year. I had so much fun with this game. It almost feels like a fever dream to play through it with its just insane side quests like Sujimon, which is like Pokemon, but with just people, which is barely even one of the weirdest things you'll get up to. But to keep it short and sweet, as much as I enjoyed this game, what keeps it from being up even higher is actually the way they handled the DLC and the poor quality of that DLC. Basically, New Game Plus was tied to a DLC. That DLC also came with like a dungeon and stuff that honestly just wasn't very good. So not only did they tie New Game Plus to a DLC, it wasn't even a good DLC. And that kind of soured the experience a bit for me at least. Now I'm aware some people might never actually play the game more than that one single time, so it might not affect you, but I was not a fan of it. Otherwise, though, had a blast. Coming at number 8, we have Another Crab's Treasure. Another Crab's Treasure is a platforming Souls-like of all things that sees you taking on the role of a hermit crab, setting off to repossess its own shell after it gets stolen from you. And while the game has a whole bunch of comedy, it's also a surprisingly moving adventure, more so than you might expect, and I can't say enough good things about it. Hands down, my indie game of the year. You should definitely play it. It has a whole host of accessibility options. There's a gun you can pull out that will just let you one-shot bosses if you're worried about the Souls-like element of it. But even that experience is super fun. So if you're looking for a great, cheap game to play, it doesn't get much better than Another Crab's Treasure. Coming in at number 7, though, we have the ever-controversial Dragon Age Veilguard. Personally, I enjoyed it a great deal, not least of which because it gave a whole host of different answers to a ton of like pressing lore questions, and that's on top of the combat being really, really fun. And more than anything, I would say I enjoyed this so much because they finally picked a direction with a Dragon Age game and ran with it, which given how they've split their fan base previously was really the best they were ever gonna do. Because of the different genres that each of those games has sort of inhabited, there was never a situation where this game was going to please everyone who is expecting different things from any Dragon Age game at this point. So ultimately, while there are parts of it I didn't enjoy so much, like essentially the inability to be a bad guy in any sense, I had a blast with it. It was fun to play. But in spite of that, it didn't actually wind up being my game of the year for 2024. That honor goes to entry number 6, which was Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, which was a very surprising entry for me, actually. I've never been super into Indiana Jones, but this is genuinely a great game. I went into it sort of expecting a relatively linear action adventure that looked decent from the previews and stuff, and while there are linear moments, it is actually broken up into 3 large explorable areas that has almost like immersive sim levels of gameplay and level design, and it's really, really well done. There's so much more here than you'd probably expect, and that's to say nothing of the puzzles that were handled really, really well. So while I have some minor gripes like the AI being a little dumb, which inadvertently kind of makes it like the movies in some ways, this game really turned into a sleeper hit from me. It was so much more than I went into it expecting. So I'd encourage you to check it out if you haven't yet. Now, with that being my game of the year this year, that leaves us with 5 more entries to go, and so naturally, every single one of those is an older title. Coming in at number 5, we have my second most played game this year with Nioh 2. Nioh 2's combat is phenomenal. To call either Nioh 1 or Nioh 2 a Souls-like is like technically accurate, but at this point, both of those games are kind of their own thing, so I don't think it necessarily fits either. But after playing Nioh 1 last year, I knew I wanted to fit Nioh 2 in this year, and I was blown away. The stuff they did with combat and the things they allow you to do with like the yokai shifts and whatnot were just incredible. Simply put, I loved it. That's why I wound up playing it so much. The combat is the real selling point though, so I would look that up, and if it looks like it's something for you, then I would definitely recommend it. Incredible combat system. At number 4, however, we have Ghost of Tsushima, which came to PC this year, which is why I was looking at it. Another fantastic narrative experience, and then you combine that with, I would say, relatively traditional open world elements that have a fresh coat of paint on them. So you'll do that sort of checklisty open world type stuff that we've seen in a lot of games, but it's done in a way that feels really fresh. Like, just as an example, the wind blowing you in the direction of your objectives and little tiny things like that that add to the atmosphere of it all and how that actually connects to the plot in a very meaningful way. So Ghost of Tsushima has just an incredible story, incredible atmosphere, and the combat can be incredibly fun as well. In fact, if you turn the game up to lethal, where both you and the enemy die very, very easily, it becomes this really tense, high-stakes thing where you're trying to fight all of these enemies at once, and you kind of need to perform like perfect combos and stuff, so even that part of it can be really exhilarating. And all of that combined is why it's so high up on the list. I enjoyed that game a lot more than I thought I was going to, and I mean, I went into it expecting it to be pretty good, so here we are. But that brings us to our top 3, and we are kicking that off with Morrowind. Morrowind is a game that I finally finished this year. I had played it plenty of times previously, I just never actually forced myself to sit down and finish it because of some of its dated mechanics, and I'm glad I finally pushed myself to do so because, unsurprisingly for a guy who likes dated CRPGs, I suppose, Morrowind really hit the nail on the head for me. I loved the main story and how all of that comes together and the lore drops from Vivek, and honestly, all the other reasons people will tell you they love Morrowind, but it was just a really great experience. So even while parts of it are certainly dated, the most important bits are still hanging in there quite strong. But at number 2, we then have Oblivion, a controversial take for some, I'm sure, but this is definitely probably the moment of the list where people will see that my own biases are very real. I love Oblivion. It's one of those games I know like the back of my hand, and that was before I even went into it for the review. I am extremely familiar with Oblivion. I played it this year after playing a whole bunch of Bethesda titles recently, sort of to just, I would say, put a definitive end to a certain chapter of my life. I was going through some things, and it was well worth the experience. I loved it. And I say all that knowing full well that Oblivion is a bit of a broken mess. I think things like the level scaling are just awful mechanics, but I still love that game in spite of all those things, and this is ultimately a ranking of my own personal feelings, which is why it's number 2. Now, at the same time, it's one of those games that if you have not played and you go play it now, you'll probably not enjoy it very much. But both the time of my life in which I played it and recently with this review and the reasons that I was doing that review to begin with all coalesced again into just a very great experience for me personally. So that one is absolutely all of my own biases showing, but I love Oblivion, and that's why it ranks so high. But there is one more game higher than that if we're not including Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, and that is The Witcher 3. Another game I know very, very well that I finally reviewed this year. I had actually made some content for it way back when, but I was kind of going through the Witcher games again because I had never reviewed any of them despite playing them all pretty thoroughly well before I started doing content creation full time, and The Witcher 3 was just the logical end to that. And like the vast majority of people, I think The Witcher 3 is a tremendous game. Incredible storytelling. Gwent on its own is really fun. I enjoy the way the hunts work, seeing the culmination of the trilogy and how that ended with the Wild Hunt and all the lead up to that, and then of course everything with Ciri and whatnot. It's just an incredible game, which is why The Witcher 4 has some incredibly oversized shoes to fill, and we'll have to see how that game manages to compare. But that is pretty much going to do it for this rankings video. There are all the games I reviewed this year, presented in perhaps the most biased and opinionated way possible, which hopefully people got some enjoyment out of. That said, I'd love to hear all about the games you enjoyed the most this year. Obviously, I play more than most people, but nonetheless, I can hardly play everything. In spite of that, there are things I miss all the time. There's a couple games in particular, actually, I'm probably going to review in January that I didn't get to this year. So I would simply love to know what games you enjoyed the most, because I love gaming, I love this community, and nothing brightens up my day quite like talking video games with people, so hopefully it's the same for you. And to that end, given that this should be going up on Christmas Eve, I'd like to wish you a very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, may you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.